So we're going to go through the introduction and background of this. I'm going to talk a bit about the previous surveys that were done, what they found, how they were conducted. And then Kaylee's going to take it over and talk a bit about how we developed the current survey, a little bit about what we're doing in terms of analyzing it, and just a few preliminary findings in terms of where we're, and some sense as to where we're going with this. There's going to be a lot more to come in the future regarding this. Next slide. So if we look back at again, I give great credit to the previous PAC. Prior to when I was on it, they developed a survey that they administered to members of the CCA. And the first survey was done about 20 years ago, as I'll talk about. And there's been a lot that's changed since that time. So we know, and Mark even alluded to this, that the whole quality of gluten-free products has improved, the availability has improved. We think there's an increasing awareness both in the medical field, in the medical community, in the food service community, and just in the general public about celiac disease. We have new labeling laws that are now about a decade old. And there's obviously the information explosion of that there's so much of information available on the internet. And there's been a lot of research in celiac disease that really has now led to developing some medication that might be useful. We still don't have one yet, but there's a promise that we're getting there. And then, of course, we've got the curveball of things like COVID in the past few years, which have affected all of us. So there's been a lot of changes, and so we thought, both at Celiac Canada and at the PAC, that it would be worth looking again at where we're at with celiac disease in Canada and what are the challenges that are facing individuals. What is the progress that's been made? What still needs to be done, and what should we prioritize with respect to advocacy? Next slide. So just to give you some sense as to where we've come from, the first survey was developed in 2002, and the results were published in 2007, gives you some sense of how long it takes to get these things rolled out and finally published. Again, I want to give credit to the PAC at the time. You can see them listed here. And particularly maybe a shout out to Shelley Case, who's still part of the PAC, who's been a real contributor in many ways, both to the PAC and to celiac disease in general. And these were the people that were involved initially. And the initial survey was sent to about 5,200 members. This was a paper survey with all the difficulties with paper surveys. And there was a remarkable 65% response rate. So 3,400 people responded. Of those, there were about 2,600 that had biopsy-proven celiac disease that we really focused on. Next slide. And, the initial, if you look at just some of the data, some of the highlights of what the survey showed, it showed that, not surprisingly, that celiac disease affected individuals of all ages. This is age of diagnosis, perhaps underdiagnosed at this stage in the pediatric group. And the vast majority of the diagnosis being made in people between their 20s and 60s. But again, at both extremes, a diagnosis still being made. And of this group, about 75% were female, so about a 3-to-1 ratio. And the mean diagnosis age was about 46. The mean age of the people that responded to the survey was about 56. Next slide. And this survey looked at a lot of things related to symptoms, diagnoses, how the diagnosis was made. And you can see the common symptoms that people presented with. And they certainly were gastrointestinal were the most common. So bloating and abdominal pain ranked number 1 at 83%. People obviously had multiple presenting complaints. Diarrhea was also very common, as was weight loss. And this is something we're quite aware of. If you look further down the list, and these are substantial numbers, some of the extraintestinal type manifestations, things like bone and joint pain, easy bruising, anemia, mood swings, depression were also found. I've always used this slide for medical students to show that you can have constipation and have celiac disease. So constipation doesn't rule it out. So it's very helpful to get a sense as to what the symptom complex was. And the other thing that's interesting about this question was also, that people don't always fully recover with some of these things. And so sometimes there's multifactorial things going on, and there's other conditions that might be impacting. And it really makes a case for wanting to continue to follow individuals with celiac disease to try and sort this out. Next slide. And you can see that there were other medical conditions that people have, and we're more and more aware of this, things like iron deficiency, osteoporosis, thyroid disease, and other autoimmune diseases such as rheumatoid, type 1 diabetes, etc. It turns out that there isn't a link between cancer, breast cancer, and colon cancer and celiac disease, so some people had those things. There is a small link with lymphomas and small intestinal cancer, but very uncommon. Next slide. And finally, just a little bit about, that because celiac can present in so many ways, and we've always known this, but back in 2002, it kind of drew attention to the fact that prior to the diagnosis, people might be labeled just having anemia NYD, as having stress, as having irritable bowel syndrome, as having food allergies or chronic fatigue. These were all diagnoses that were given to individuals prior to the diagnosis, and we know that the diagnosis can be difficult if you don't think about it. Next slide. And if you were to take one fact away from that survey, it was that the time to diagnosis really was quite long, and the reported time from symptoms to actual diagnosis was 11.7 years. And that was, I think, one of the major findings. Next slide. So the next survey that was done, and this one was sent out 6 years later in 2008, this focused a bit more, not on the diagnosis and the medical aspects, but more on the gluten-free diet and the effect that celiac disease and the gluten-free diet had on quality of life. Again, individuals from the PAC were involved, people like Marian Zarkadis, people like Moses and Rashid. And then we also, this was a collaborative effort also with the Public Health Agency in Ottawa and the Food Directorate at Health Canada, which also was very helpful. Next slide. And this survey was, again, a similar demographic that, again, about 3-to-1 female to male ratio. The mean age of participants was about 56 years. And the mean diagnosis was, again, about 46 years. So very similar demographic to the first survey. This survey was a bit different in that it included members from the Quebec Celiac Association, the FQMC. And so there turned out to be that there were 7,800 respondents in total out of over 10,000 members from both associations, again, for a very high response rate, which is always so commendable for any celiac study. Many survey studies were happy if we have 20 to 30% response rates, and with celiac disease, we always seem to do better than that. Next slide. And so this, as I say, this study looked a bit more at gluten-free diet. What effect does that gluten-free diet have on individuals, and where do they get their information from? And this tells you just how important the association has been. 90% of people found that information very helpful. When you look at healthcare professionals, so dietitians, if you look at the gastroenterologist, family doctor, this information wasn't found to be as useful. At this stage in time, the internet was also not really up there. And it kind of tells you the time that this may have been sent out, that people weren't embracing the internet quite as much. But I think we took away from this is that we perhaps had some way to go with respect to healthcare professionals. Next slide. And the survey looked at some of the challenges of people on a gluten-free diet, and looked at both positive and negative emotions. First of all, after diagnosis, many people, and this is, I think, where Celiac Canada is very helpful with newly diagnosed individuals. There's frustration. People feel overwhelmed. They feel isolated, confusion. Fortunately, over time, these things get better. But you can see on the right side of this table that, and again, the question was again asked in the month before the survey. So presumably, people had celiac disease for many months or years after. When they answered the question, there was still some significant negative emotions related to gluten-free diets at that point, and it seemed to be statistically, at least, women had more difficulties with some of these than men. Next slide. And this slide, again, for all of you who are listening, who are living a gluten-free life, these numbers won't surprise you that when it comes to for instance, eating in restaurants, and some of the difficulties that people have, very, very high numbers at that point. And even in terms of eating with family and friends, there are some issues, gluten-free preparation challenges, and purchasing gluten-free foods. This, of course, was, the survey was completed prior to the new labeling laws. Next slide. And so in the end, just to summarize these two surveys, first one, 2002, excellent response rate. One of the key findings was this delay in diagnosis. The second study in 2008, looking more at the effects of gluten-free diet and celiac disease on quality of life, where we again had an excellent response rate of 5,912 individuals that had biopsy-proven celiac disease by report. And again, one of the key results, aside from looking at some of the effects of gluten-free diets and some of the difficulties, was that we had to improve both healthcare workers and also food industry workers in terms of their knowledge about this. So again, we think these were very successful. As I mentioned, this kind of set the stage for us to say, look, it's probably time, now that we're 20 years beyond the first study, to look, and given all the changes, it's time to look at some of these issues again and see what has changed. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kaylee, and Kaylee's going to take it from here.
Thanks, Don. So now that we've learned a little bit about the previous survey, let's take a closer look at the latest survey that Celiac Canada conducted in 2022. So we started with a project plan. We knew that we wanted to create an updated health survey, and we had a goal to understand if diagnosis rates and quality of life in people with celiac disease have improved in the past 20 years. We knew that this time around we needed to modernize the survey for current language and terms. And instead of a printed survey, we wanted to use an electronic survey tool like SurveyMonkey. And this would allow us to collect a broader range of demographics to better reflect Canadians, and of course, save a ton of time for the data analysis. For the survey development, we had a subcommittee of Celiac Canada's Professional Advisory Council, or PAC, and we got together and we started working. What we did is we took the previous two surveys, we looked at all of the questions, and we really decided which ones we wanted to ask again, and if there were any new sections or new questions that we wanted to add. For example, we added a full section for COVID, and then one on gluten-free food affordability, food insecurity, and taxation, because they were very relevant. Once we decided on all of the questions that we wanted to include in the latest survey, we transferred them from paper into our electronic survey tool, SurveyMonkey. And then to test the survey before it was administered, we piloted it with a group of 10 to 15 people with celiac disease and a few celiac professionals. So this is just a slide showing kind of like the range of topics that the survey included. So we had questions on diagnosis. We really wanted to learn the path to diagnosis. We wanted to learn more about the symptoms before versus after going on a gluten-free diet and being diagnosed, disease associations, questions about adherence to a gluten-free diet. We wanted to know the impact of following a gluten-free diet, and then quality of life questions too. We wanted to know people's emotions, how they felt before versus after going on a gluten-free diet, as well as the psychosocial challenges of managing celiac disease and the gluten-free diet. So this question here, it is an example of a new question that we added on the gluten-free diet adherence. So the PAC revised this question from the Gluten-Free Eating Assessment Tool, or GF-EAT, and respondents chose one of those 5 descriptors listed there, which best characterize their current diet. So whether it be frequent gluten exposure, more than once per week, rare accidental or rare intentional gluten exposure, to no gluten exposure at all. In the past, in the previous surveys, we just asked a yes or no question. So do you eat gluten? Yes or no. So this new question, it'll really allow us to look at the frequency of self-reported gluten exposure and its effect on quality of life. We also had some eligibility criteria. So in order to participate in this survey, people had to voluntarily agree. They had to be at least 18 years of age, so it was an adults only survey. Currently living in Canada. And then they also had to have a medical condition for which they followed a gluten-free diet. So whether that be celiac disease, dermatitis herpetiformis, or non-celiac gluten sensitivity. So moving right into the launch of the survey. We officially launched the survey on September 25th, 2022. During that time, we did a lot of promotion and advertising. We did it through paid and organic social posts. We had it on our website. We did it through e-blasts. We posted it in our CCA Connects multiple times and our magazine. And then we also had a news release with Research Canada. Our final call was, we mentioned it in last year's November conference, asking people to take it before it closed, and then it officially closed December 22nd, 2022. So this is kind of an overview. During the 12 weeks that the survey was opened, we received a total of 7,491 responses, making it the largest Canadian celiac survey to date. And we were very pleased about this number. We've definitely reached our goal there. So after the survey closed at the end of 2022, we moved right into analyzing the data. So we hired a statistician who was James King. He is completing his PhD at the University of Calgary, and he's also a former James A. Campbell, or JAC, Young Investigator winner with Celiac Canada. So James shared some initial findings or key results that we have from this current survey. So let's move into them. Starting with demographics, this graph shows our distribution of respondents. So we were really able to collect responses from all across Canada in every province and territory, with the majority from Ontario, Alberta, and BC, respectively. Just over 3/4, or 75% of respondents, were from urban areas, and 4 out of 5, or 80 respondents, were female. This graph shows the distribution of people who filled it out based on their time of diagnosis. So as you can see, we had a good distribution of respondents from each one of these categories. We had respondents who were newly diagnosed, filled it out, who were diagnosed less than 6 months ago, all the way up to those experienced people with celiac disease, diagnosed more than 25 years ago. So the average age of respondents for this latest survey was 54 years old, which was a bit younger than the previous surveys. We also looked at this age and how it differed according to the time of diagnosis. So 45 years was the average age for those diagnosed in the past 2 years, while 68 years was the average for those diagnosed over 25 years ago. So this stat really shows that the average age at diagnosis is trending downwards in more recent years. And then for race, half of people did not provide this information, but from those who did, the majority were white or Caucasian. So this is one of our big findings, the delay in diagnosis. Just to back up and remind you what Dawn discussed. So from the previous 2002 survey, it showed a mean delay in diagnosis of 11.7 years. That was 20 years ago. So the current state of celiac survey has shown over 1/3 or 37% of respondents still describe a delay to diagnosis of 10 years or longer. Conversely, just under 1/4 or 23% of respondents reported a diagnosis within 2 years of symptom onset. So yes, we see the numbers improving a bit, but there's still a ton of work that needs to be done here. And this is really going to be a huge focus for Celiac Canada and our awareness and advocacy efforts. We're really trying to shorten the time between symptom onset and diagnosis, which will ultimately help prevent people from years of suffering. So to conclude, Celiac Canada, we launched a major comprehensive health study that was updated from our previous surveys conducted 20 years ago. We received a huge response, 7,491, making it the largest to date. Findings from this survey will help us learn more about the state of celiac in Canada today and how it's changed in the past 20 years. It will help inform our advocacy efforts, the creation of new educational resources and programs that will help improve the quality of life of people with celiac disease and other gluten-related disorders. And I just wanted to put up this slide just to show kind of an overview of our 2024 plans. So 2024 is really going to be our State of Celiac year. We're going to be focusing on releasing these results basically all throughout the year. We'll be attending conferences. We've already submitted a few abstracts for the Canadian Digestive Disease Week. We'll hopefully be attending the Digestive Disease Week in Washington and having a poster presentation of these results at ICDS, which is in England, Sheffield this year. So lots of exciting stuff around the state of celiac in 2024. And stay tuned. So get excited for our official launch of the full survey data, which will be released the end of February 2024. And finally, a big special thanks to our donors and to CADA for allowing this research to happen. We wouldn't be able to conduct or participate in important research like this without your continued support. So thank you, and I'll open the floor to questions.
So some questions about the data. Was there any, apologies if this was missed, but was there any sense of what percentage of the survey respondents were asymptomatic before being diagnosed? Any data on that?
So, Mark, can you hear me there?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so we absolutely have that data. That's a very important aspect. I don't have the numbers right at the tip of my tongue right now, but James is looking at that. We want to get a full characterization both of asymptomatic individuals, people that have atypical symptoms, et cetera. So that's been one of the things come February that we're going to be telling people about. Very important, very issue.
Yeah, we really wanted to save these, a lot of the big results for the official launch in February. So it is coming. Okay,
so it's like a preview snapshot of what's to come. Okay, so I understand not everything can be released now. There was a couple of questions about differences for, this is probably more for Dawn as well, long-term effects if you were diagnosed as a celiac later in life, like for example, 40s, 50s. I know you do a lot of work on bone health and that, for example, Dawn.
Sure. Yeah, I think that, one of the things that we still don't know about with celiac disease is how long people have had it. So it's certainly possible to develop celiac in your 40s or 50s, and it may be a short duration between symptom onset and diagnosis. You get diagnosed, you start on a gluten-free diet. And we think if there's been a brief exposure period, then probably the effects are not as great. If you have been undiagnosed for many years, then there are increasing risks, and bone health being one of them, the other being other autoimmune diseases like thyroid disease. So it probably does have something to do with how long it takes to get diagnosed. But some people now, because celiac disease can develop in people's 60s, 70s, if it's picked up quickly, then I think people recover more quickly, and the chances of developing other things are less likely.
Mm-hmm. All right, thank you. Kaylee, you mentioned that the survey info will be available next February for data geeks like me. Kudos to whoever asked this question. Is there somewhere where the survey results data will be able to be analyzed in greater detail?
Yes, so we'll be having a full official launch. Those plans are still to come. We'll announce them and we'll keep everyone updated, but there will be a full webinar. We'll have blog posts. It'll be in our newsletters, our magazine. You won't be able to miss it.
The other thing, Mark, just to mention in that regard is that I can't emphasize just how much data there is. James King is spending a lot of time looking at this, and so there'll be stuff coming out in February. There'll be stuff coming out later in the year as well, because as we go through this data, we can look at things from different angles, and so there should be regular, I would say, updates and things that come up really over 2024.
I suspect this person might have been asking about getting their hands on the raw data. I imagine for confidentiality and that perhaps not that kind of thing can't be released, or?
Correct. So probably the raw data wouldn't be released. However, we're interested in anybody that has interesting questions. If they want to be in touch with us, that's fine. I think, Kaylee, the other thing, we will have something on the website, right, in terms of the results.
Yes. Yeah, there'll be a whole web page on the State of Celiac survey results.
Okay. I will be looking forward to seeing that. Any insight from either of you on why women were so much more responsive in the surveys? Do you think it's an indication of higher diagnosis rates, or just more awareness or interest in doing surveys?
Yeah, I would say it's probably a combination. We do think that it is, with many autoimmune diseases, women seem more prone to it, and I think celiac is one of those. So that's a factor. I think women likely are better at filling out surveys too. So I think it is a combination of both those things. And just a postulate from my point of view is that I think not in all cases, but in many cases, women are quite involved in food prep as well, and so they this affects them very personally. Not that men aren't either, but it may be a bit more, maybe more so.
Okay. Thank you. And Kaylee, you talked a bit about the racial background of survey participants. So is there any way to see a comparison between the number of people from different ethnic backgrounds who have celiac disease between general populations?
Yeah, so that's another thing that James King is working on. So we can pull that data, and some of that data will be shared in February when it gets released.
Okay. Will there also be? Oh, sorry, Don. Go ahead. Yeah.
I was just going to say, Mark. I think that we're quite aware of the fact that celiac does affect individuals of many different racial backgrounds, and we probably haven't captured as much of the ethnic diversity as we would like. We'll be looking at that, and I think this may lead to us trying to target certain ethnic groups where perhaps we don't have as much representation, just to see in the survey, just to see what effects celiac has on them as well.
Mm-hmm. Great, glad to hear it. Any correlation between, so this person's asking about like the length of time between symptom onset and diagnosis, does that vary at all by the province or territory, i.e. are some provinces perhaps doing better at testing?
Yeah, no, I think that's the whole issue of delay in diagnosis. We will be looking at lots of variables, that being one of them, and a whole bunch of other ones to see what are the correlates. So it's a great question, and stay tuned.
Mm-hmm. And the survey data probed some personal questions. I do want to caution all attendees that our speakers are not your personal medical advisors, of course. They can't give personalized advice, but many of the conditions that you mentioned in your questions do apply to a lot of people. So our speakers are, of course, happy to respond in a general sense. So in this case, people talking, there's several we're talking about, like, I follow the gluten-free diet strictly, but follow-up endoscopies are still showing inflammation, or like that may or may not be accompanied by symptoms like gut pain or stomach pain. Is that normal?
Yeah, one of the things that we've certainly found is that the time to complete recovery of the biopsy does take time, I know in many studies, if you were to biopsy routinely at 2 years, about half of individuals, even when they're feeling well, even when they're being very adherent, they still have some changes present. So it does take time. I think it still is super important to be as adherent as you can to minimize exposure. But I do think the natural history is one of it takes time.
And as Dr. Duerksen is also a gastroenterologist, someone asked, is there, as a lack of gastroenterologists, perhaps a primary cause of late diagnosis?
I think, you know, if you look at it, I think that people usually go to their family doctor first. And I think the approach that we've taken is that we really want to make sure family physicians are well educated with respect to celiac disease. And now that there is serologic testing available across the country, including Ontario, that testing can be done initially. And so that's the starting point of picking things up. Now, where the gastroenterologists come in and they do pick them up as well, but I think that the time from being serologically positive, then getting a biopsy to confirm it, that's another area of potential delay. And I think there are some issues across the country with respect to gastroenterologists being available, and also the time to getting an endoscopy. And I think that's a second issue. So I think that whole time frame is one that we're interested in trying to optimize, again, with the whole goal of trying to shorten this as much as we can.
And I think too, when you look at symptoms of celiac disease, there's around 300 symptoms and none are specific to celiac disease. So there's a huge range going from gastrointestinal symptoms all the way up to neurological. So it can be really difficult to diagnose.
Yeah, definitely the 12-year stat is disappointing. We hope to get that down to one or less. Do you have any idea on how that number compares to global numbers? Like, how are we comparing to other Western countries or countries in general?
You know, we don't, or at least I don't. My sense is that we don't have a survey like this in other countries. There are other reports of delayed diagnosis, but in terms of direct comparisons, it really would be interesting, because there are some countries, and I know some of the countries in Europe are now doing more active screening of celiac disease. Now, I think their awareness is probably greater, and so I would think they would probably be doing better than us, but I don't have that direct data.
Yeah, so the 22 survey talked about frequent delay in diagnosis over 10 years, but the sample group was larger than the previous surveys. So like, did you find that there was an improvement?
Right, we're going to be looking at, you know, what is the delay in diagnosis in people diagnosed, you know, 20 plus years ago, 10 to 20 years ago, et cetera, to see if we'll be definitely getting more granular on that front to see what the trend is. It's going to be a very important question.
Okay, and our last question, there was a talk of looking at anxiety, depression, confusion, frustration. Any thoughts on, like, is the mental health impact, are the mental health impacts of celiac disease something that is studied enough, needs more study?
Again, I think it needs more study. I absolutely needs more study. It's something that this survey is looking at, both with respect to you know, the direct effects of celiac disease on those things, and then the effects of a gluten-free diet potentially, with some of the vigilance associated with that. That creates its own sometimes some the own issues, with respect to managing that. So it's something that our survey is going to look at just from a descriptive point of view, but I think it's something that overall needs to be, more research needs to be addressed on that. You know, we're going to be hearing today about neurologic manifestations of celiac disease. I think it's a really important area, and I think it's I think we're going to hear some really good information on that whole aspect.
All right. Well, thanks to both of you for this presentation, and thanks to James for all your work on the State of Celiac survey. I know this is something that's watched around the world, in the world of celiac disease, and it's really, really exciting. So looking forward to the results coming out in February. And thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Mark.
Thanks, Mark.
Thank you.